Hi, everybody. My name is Jodi Axelson, and I'm a cooperative extension specialist for UC Extension and based on the Berkeley campus. Today, I'm going to talk about forest mortality and regeneration. So, sort of what happens after bark beetle outbreaks. Other areas aside from California have a lot of experience with large bark beetle outbreaks. And so, I'm going to draw on some of those lessons and you sort of talk about the California context specifically because it is a unique environment and you can't just compare other areas directly. So first thing is the term forest dynamics. And so this sort of describes underlying processes, both physical and biological, that shape forest ecosystems. And while you don't always notice it, forests are continuously changing. And these can be the forces that interact to change forests can be basically summarized by disturbances. So that could be insects, bark beetles, drought, fire, and then succession. So what happens after the disturbance? And so it's easy to think that forests stay the same because they change on time trajectories that are longer than what we're used to sort of thinking about. But these dynamic elements of disturbance and succession really shape kind of forest structure and composition and ecosystem processes. I want to start by introducing some terminology that I'm going to use throughout this talk. So my research and expertise is in forest management and forest dynamics, and so I'm really familiar with these terms, but I want to make sure that you are. So we have overstory and understory. These are two basic terms that I'll use throughout the presentation. And then within those, we've got canopy and subcanopy. So this diagram kind of shows what I mean. When I talk about the overstory of a forest, I'm talking about those large individuals, those mature trees, and the canopy trees are the ones that sort of form that canopy layer, that the main age of the forest sort of ends up being canopy. Depending on the forest, you have this subcanopy. So in a lot of the forests I've seen in California, this ends up being our fir and incense cedar layer. So they're taller trees, but they're not as tall as this main layer. So you can kind of think of it as a bit of a layer cake. Then in the understory, understory could include shrubs. It could include flowers and herbs and grasses. I primarily talk about understory as trees. So saplings, these are trees that are kind of above your chest height and taller, but you would definitely consider them young trees. And then the seedlings are these little guys right down here. These are these really little, small germinants. We classify these as being quite small on the forest floor. You tend to get a lot of mortality in this seedling layer. And so this is just a diagram to keep in mind throughout the talk as I use these terms. So disturbance characteristics. There's key attributes of disturbances, and these include what type of disturbance it was. So, for example, fire, bark beetles. These are two examples of biotic disturbances, or actually fire is an abiotic disturbance, and then bark beetles are a biotic disturbance. So the type is really important. The severity. So to stay with bark beetles and fires, a fire might burn very severely and kill a lot of trees, or it might be more of a low severity fire and only kill a small number of trees or just smaller trees. And the same can go with bark beetles. So the severity is an important piece of this. The spatial and temporal characteristics. So what I mean by this is the area over which the disturbance acts on. So this could be at the stand level, or it could be at the landscape level. And so sort of the impacts are really influenced by how large a disturbance is. So for example, you could have a tree blow down on your property over the wintertime. And that would be a very small sort of stand level disturbance. Whereas this drought and bark beetle outbreak, especially more in the Southern Sierra, we're seeing the mortality across the landscape. So you have very different outcomes based on this. And then for the temporal characteristics, this is really kind of time. So it's a disturbance operating over a very short time frame. So probably one winter storm that blew the tree over on your property versus a longer time frame. So bark beetle outbreaks tend to be multiple years of mortality. Then you have the return interval and the historic range of variability. And I'll kind of get into that a little bit more further down the road here. Of course, also you have disturbance interactions, and I'll talk a little bit about what I mean there as well. Oops. Okay, so disturbance impacts. So historically, fires burn fairly regularly within the Sierra Nevada. And so these were either lightning ignitions or they were set by Native Americans to maintain certain forest conditions. And that's sort of what I mean by historical range of variability. These were disturbances that used to occur kind of anywhere from 10 to 30 years, fairly regular intervals in the past before we started suppressing fires really well in the beginning of the 1900s. And so you had these fires that when they're low severity, thin from below. And what I mean by that is, as you can see in these pictures, you have these low flame heights, you have this fire kind of creeping through a forest, and it's not making its way into the overstory crowns. It's mainly staying on the ground, and it's really killing those smaller trees. So it's sort of thinning the forest naturally. And this creates this more open condition or stand that you can see through, like you see in the picture on the right. Now, thinning from above, bark beetles are really a good example of this, because most bark beetles, especially the ones that do a lot of the landscape level damage we're seeing in California, so the western pine beetle, the mountain pine beetle at higher elevations, possibly Jeffrey pine beetle, these are all dendroctonous beetles, and they prefer larger trees. They prefer larger trees because of their biology. And so they'll have the best reproductive success in larger trees. So those are the ones that they're killing. So they're sort of thinning from above, right? They're taking out those larger trees. So you can see on the left here, this creates large openings, and then you start to get this succession or regeneration of tree species. The picture on the right is illustrating this as well, where those large pine trees are being killed, and the trees that are left behind are either not pine, so probably incense, cedar, or fir, or they're too small to be a suitable host. So the outcome of the disturbance really depends on whether you're getting this thinning from below activity, or in the case what we've seen with the mortality in California, this thinning from above. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what's happened after bark beetle outbreaks in some other areas of Western North America. So I've done a lot of research in British Columbia and Alberta, and I'm going to talk about some of that research now. So in the central part of BC, in a place called the Chilcotin Plateau, we have a number of long-term plots. And what these plots that were established in the 1970s and measured periodically through time, through different bark beetle outbreaks. And so what these plots have really illustrated is that repeated mountain pine beetle outbreaks have shifted the size of the trees in the forest, because bark beetles are killing the larger and older trees, but not the species. So this is an example of an ecosystem where lodgepole pine is regenerating under its own canopy, and we see an increase in aspen. And this isn't really typical following bark beetle outbreaks necessarily. So this diagram kind of demonstrates the way we think about disturbances in this particular ecosystem. So historically, before fire suppression, we had these multiple mixed low severity fires. And so this cookie of a dead tree shows that nicely. So this tree was scarred in 1890 by a fire, but it didn't kill the tree. So these mixed severity fires would have created some mortality, mostly in the smaller size classes, and thinned out the forest. And so this creates a more open stand. Eventually, because the light conditions are right and whatnot, you have some level of regeneration occur, and this starts to create mixed ages. In California, there's a lot of mixed age stands, right? And so this is probably very familiar to you. Then you get a bark beetle outbreak. And so what's happening is instead of those small trees being eliminated by mixed severity fires, you're getting the largest tree now killed by the mountain pine beetle, which results in this tree mortality, which eventually, those dead trees will eventually fall down into a coarse woody debris pool. And so you get this thinning, but you get this thinning from above. And so this drives your size classes down. So the beetles killed the largest trees, and now you have a smaller, unsuitable host that's left behind. So you have this residual overstory and subcanopy. And so as time moves forward, the system sort of adjusts. You get this more uneven age stand. Now, instead of this going back to fire, as historically we believed it would have been, it goes back to a bark beetle outbreak, right? And so you get these successive waves of bark beetle outbreaks over multiple decades that results in smaller trees, and in the case of central British Columbia, regeneration to pine. In another study we did in southern BC, so, in the grand scheme of things, not that far away, we see quite a different scenario. So in those plots, what we see is that mountain pine beetle shifts the size structure of stands, but it's also shifting the regenerating species. So this is a shift in structure and composition. So as you can see in this picture, there is actually people in there. This is a fairly dense stand, and this is really mostly an even age stand of lodgepole pine. So this stand regenerated after a large fire event in the early 1900s, probably one of the last fire to burn on this stand. We have this very even aged forest condition with a closed canopy. And unlike the central interior, where the canopies are much open and we have these sort of bare exposed soils, here we see a lot of pine grass and moss covering the forest floor. And this is important. So what we see here is our saplings and our seedlings. So these are our small trees that are sort of the youngest trees in the stand. Between these different stands that we sampled, there's a huge variety of what is coming up in terms of its density, so trees per hectare, and the percentage of species that occupy the area. And so really the take home on this is in all of our saplings, they almost all are Douglas fir and spruce, in this case, or trembling aspen. And the seedlings, except for this one site, which actually does have a lot of lodgepole pine regeneration, they're almost all Douglas fir. And so what we consider this is a system that is shifting toward a more shade-tolerant condition, and it's eventually going to become quite a different stand because these trees will grow up and be a different species than the ones that were there before the outbreak. Some work I'm working on right now is a study, again, it's a nice example of what we can learn when we do longitudinal studies, so long-term studies. This was a set of plots that was established in the Rocky Mountains of Alberta in the early 1980s after a mountain pine beetle outbreak impacted Waterton Lakes National Park. This is in the far southwestern corner of Alberta, and this park borders Glacier National Park in Montana. What these plots show us over time was similar to the southern British Columbia example, is that mountain pine beetle has generated a shift in the size and in the species. And so this results in a change to the structure and the composition of these forests. So what we went from in the 1970s, before the outbreak occurred, was an overstory dominated by lodgepole pine, to those that are now have a mixed species composition, and an understory dominated by shade-tolerant species with almost no or none in terms of pine regeneration. And so I'm going to show you that. This is an example of a stand that had 29% mortality created by the mountain pine beetle. And what we're seeing in each of these graphs is, so this top graph is our overstory, so those canopy trees. This is our sapling layer, and then here's our regeneration, those really small guys. Here on the y-axis, we have what we had before the outbreak in the 1980s, then that first measurement when these plots were established, and then when we went back in 2002 and 2010. And then this is showing us the density of trees in the landscape. Again, it's trees per hectare. And so in this particular stand, our starting condition was mainly lodgepole pine, but a little bit of a mix. This blue color is spruce, and this green color is poplar. So this was a stand that had a little bit of mixed species to start out with. An initial condition tends to be really important when we think of what happens after a disturbance. So the mountain pine beetle killed around 30% of the trees in this stand. And so as we see through time, lodgepole pine is decreasing in this stand, and our amounts of poplar and interior spruce are increasing in relative importance. When we look at what's happening underneath the overstory, we get a really different picture. So our saplings, in 2002, there wasn't very many of them. They were almost all poplar. And by 2010, when we revisited the stand, they really grew up a lot, from these two measurement periods. And we see a sapling layer dominated by poplar, and the yellow color is aspen. In regeneration, so those really small trees, we're seeing this dominated by subalpine fir in this bright teal color. So, the future of this forest is going to be a lot less pine and a lot more other species, including poplar and subalpine fir. This is an example of the same study, same park, but a different stand where we had 93% more overstory mortality by the bark beetle. So you see this very strong reduction in the lodgepole pine component from pre-outbreak to 1981. A minuscule amount of pine is left, leaving mostly a very open condition, because we have very few trees per hectare, of subalpine fir and interior spruce. In the sapling layer, we see a understory cohort that is subalpine fir and poplar, and also some aspen, and a regenerating layer of these little babies that is almost all subalpine fir. So the reason this matters is bark beetles are removing the dominant overstory canopy, and all of these layers are what becomes the future forest. So it gives us a sense of what recovery looks like, what these forests end up being. So basically the take-home message after 30 years post mountain pine beetle outbreak is this system demonstrates a lot of resilience. This is a term that we hear quite often. The mountain pine beetle outbreak reduced the amount of lodgepole pine in the story, but by doing so, it's changed the stand composition and the structure. So the age structure and the tree species. And this is what we refer to as a greater heterogeneity. We think of heterogeneity as being good. So we have higher components of non-pine species, so subalpine fir, white spruce, and balsam poplar. And this has created a greater variety of stand structures due to the mortality, tree fall, and regeneration. Overall, in these stands, there's likely a reduced probability that there'll be a severe mountain pine beetle outbreak in the future, because there's that much less host on the landscape. And so I find these kind of retrospective studies interesting, because it shows that there is life after beetle, and that bark beetle outbreaks aren't always bad. They kind of reset an ecosystem, or they sort of nudge it along in another direction. And at least in these studies, they are still forests, right? We haven't lost the forest. The forest has just changed. So there are considerations, though, in California that are unique. The studies that I was talking about previously were all in British Columbia or Alberta, so these are high latitude areas. Other areas like Colorado, Montana, Wyoming, Idaho that have had large bark beetle outbreaks, these are generally in very high elevation forests, or again, higher latitude forests. California is different because, you're much more to mid latitude, and there is a Mediterranean climate here. So there are some things that we can learn from these other studies, but that also will be unique about this bark beetle outbreak. And so even in the absence of drought, because we've had this great wet 2017, which has been great, and 2016 was pretty normal. So even in the absence of drought, mortality is still likely to continue. And this is the legacy effects of trees just being pushed beyond a threshold at which they can recover. And so this is continued sort of lagged drought mortality. And we have an elevated bark beetle population out there. So they'll continue to kill trees until that bark beetle population kind of implodes or crashes. And they always, bark beetle outbreaks always do crash at some point. And so the unknowns that I think the research community really needs to look at after this big dieback event are, will we see loss of ponderosa pine at lower elevations? Will we see conversion to other forest types or to shrubs? And this is something that some of those other jurisdictions I was talking about, these high elevation or high latitude zones, do not have the shrubs that grow in California, the ceanothus, the manzanitas, and whatnot. Will pine species across the affected areas regenerate? And I'll get into why that's a question in a little while. The lag between tree mortality and tree fall down, so how long does it take for the canopy to open up? The reason this matters is that's when you start to see other species come in or succeed or release, right? And fuels, and this is a big one, is eventually all these dead trees fall down. And so will we see a change in fire behavior because of these heavier fuel loading situations, and will that impede regeneration? So these are some questions we need to sort of tackle in the next few years to see what we can find out. In terms of reforestation questions that you may be getting from homeowners, people, these are sort of the ones that we're hearing, Susie Coker and others that work in UC Extension have been hearing. So trees have died on my property. Now what? If I plant ponderosa pine, what will happen in the next drought or bark beetle outbreak? What species are best adapted to my property? And so there's a little bit of fear that if ponderosa or different pines are planted, they're just going to die in the next go around. And so I think it's useful to look at what history and ecology can teach us in this regard. This is a graph of lake core. And so lake cores are a great paleo environmental proxy because if you, in this case, they've counted pollen concentrations, and you can do this over time. And so this gives you a sense over very large timescales what kind of communities, plant communities were present. And so at the very bottom of this graph on our y-axis is 28,000 years ago. And then at the very top is the most modern time period. So this would be the late 90s when this pollen core was collected. The arrow is indicating pine pollen. And what we see through this 28,000 year period is pine has been very common. So it's been on the landscape in California a really long time, which to me speaks to its how well it is adapted to the climate and the growing conditions in the state. So this presents like a really long time frame of pine in this sort of central Sierra area. This is a graph also of a lake core. What these dots are showing are bark beetle outbreaks that they've inferred from the core record because they found the actual fossils of dendroctonous beetles. So this is in Montana, this is in Idaho, and what they see is 8,000 years ago, there was a bark beetle outbreak, all right? And it was pretty much in both areas of both of these states and both of these cores, which suggests it was a very large landscape event. So pines have been on the landscape a really long time, and so have bark beetles. I like this excerpt from a newspaper from the Black Hills saying that after ruining 1.5 billion feet of the choicest lumber in the Black Hills and ravaging thousands of acres of the finest pine trees in the West, the little bark beetle has robbed Uncle Sam's forestry division of 10 million in the last 10 years. So this is the 1890s. So bark beetle outbreaks are not new, and this is what I'm trying to kind of get across with this. This is a native bark beetle that has been operating in the landscape arguably as long as the trees that it attacks have been there. So in California specifically, there's been some very nice work to show us that traditionally, historically, stands in the Sierra Nevada have been, they've been mixed conifer forests that were highly clustered and had gaps. And what's important about that is those gaps create this heterogeneity I was speaking about earlier. So if we look at this historical photo from Tuolumne in the 1940s, we see there must be a gap here because we have all this lodgepole pine, ponderosa pine growing. And you can just see there's openings, there's large trees, there's sort of subcanopy trees, what I would call a subcanopy. Here's an example of a sapling. So this is a really varied forest. And this, this condition resulted really from fires operating in the landscape. What we found more in the recent 100 years is these forests have closed in. They've gotten much more dense with trees, and arguably, this has created a situation with a very heavy-duty drought where you've got a lot of tree stress, okay? But it's interesting to look back at what these stands used to look like. Here's another one, also from Tuolumne, showing ponderosa pine, sugar pine, and black oak. And the part of the caption I removed, it said poorly stocked. So from a forester's perspective, it probably was poorly stocked. But at this lower elevation, this is probably what we can reasonably expect to be a better adapted type of density, right? There's a lot less trees on the landscape, and there's a lot more openings. And so you would not expect the drought stress to be as severe on the site like this, where you had this many less trees. Now, there was an outbreak of Western pine beetle in California in the early 2000s. And so these were in the southern ranges around in the San Bernardino Mountains. And in the early 2000s, there was elevated levels of drought and then elevated levels of tree mortality. So at that point, the 2001 and 2 period was the lowest recorded precip in the recorded history, which this last 2012 through 14-15 drought has surpassed. And this stimulated increases in bark beetle and wood borer populations. And so some people that worked on this reported that overall, nearly 13% of conifers, so that was 3.5 million trees, died between 2001 and 2004, and that mortality was widespread and concentrated notably in ponderosa pine and coulter pine. So we attribute this to the Western pine beetle because this is the ponderosa pine and coulter pine are the two hosts for Western pine beetle. And so the Western pine beetle is that's the abbreviation, Western pine beetle here, ended up being reported as the most common mortality agent associated with dead and dying pines throughout this region. And in some areas, the mortality reached over 80%. So ponderosa and coulter pines greater than 17 inches DBH experienced 73 to 78% mortality in each of those species. And again, this demonstrates that how these bark beetles, these dendroctonous bark beetles, like those larger trees. And so it ends up being a thinning from above. Despite continuing drought throughout this period, that Western pine beetle outbreak rapidly declined in 2004, and therefore the mortality really slowed down as well. Now, what I want to talk about a little bit now is the ecology of pines, so ponderosa pine and sugar pine specifically, because this is the greatest amount of mortality is occurring in these two tree species with this drought. And it will become clear why this is sort of an important part of the story, and I've alluded to it already. This link here at the bottom will take you to a freely available document, sorry about that, that will tell you a lot about the life history, the ecology, the uses of different tree species, native tree species throughout North America. And it's a great resource if you really want to learn about ponderosa pine or gray pine or whatever, they're all there. And so you can follow that link. So in ponderosa pine in California is associated with a number of different tree species, such as true firs, incense cedar, at higher elevations, Jeffrey pine, sugar pine, Douglas fir, which is mainly more in the northern part of the Sierra, and black oak. And so it tends to be associated with these trees, but it also is shade intolerant. So it's sort of the pioneer. You can think about it as the pioneer, often in association with these other species. It is the bigger tree in the stand. And so it thrives because it's getting the lion's share of the sun. They're shade intolerant. They're very drought tolerant, which makes them very well adapted to a Mediterranean climate and California specifically. They're fire resistant. They have incredibly thick bark when they get to be big old trees. So they were very well adapted to that sort of historical fire regime, where fires burned at much lower intensity than we've seen in the last few decades and burnt much more frequently. And so those fires wouldn't hurt these big old trees because their canopies were so far off the ground and their bark was so thick, it was insulating them from fire damage. They are a host for the western pine beetle. Now, if we look at sugar pine also occurs in mixed conifer forests, and it has many of the same associates as ponderosa. It is also shade intolerant, which is why it's often the biggest tree in the forest. It's less drought tolerant than ponderosa pine. It likes wetter sites, which is often why you see it higher up, whereas ponderosa pine will be sort of the first pine species you'll see in the true conifer zone, right? You move out of that chaparral and through that sort of oak and gray pine. When you really start to see coniferous forests be continuous, it's almost always in ponderosa pine. So less drought tolerant than ponderosa pine. Sugar pine is fire tolerant as well. It's got very thick bark. Sugar pine is a host for the mountain pine beetle, so not the western pine beetle, and white pine blister rust, which is an invasive introduced rust and has been quite devastating to this species. Now, in terms of the suitability for these species to regenerate on their own, both of these pine species require gaps that will create the right light environment with minimal shade. The reason they're the biggest trees in the stand, often as mature trees, is because they were able to regenerate and grow in very open conditions. They do not like shade. They need to regenerate or be planted in bare mineral soil. So this is sort of why you tend to see this shift, like I talked about in those earlier studies, this shift in species after bark beetle outbreaks toward more shade tolerant species. The reason for that is A, they can take the shade, but B, they can regenerate on mossy ground or ground that has a lot of organic layers accumulated on it. So leaves, needles, different duffs. You can think of it like nature's mulch. They don't mind doing that at all. Pines, on the other hand, like a bare mineral soil. And you rarely get that after a bark beetle outbreak because the soil substrate hasn't been impacted, right? A fire, you can see that you have that bare mineral soil and then you get that regeneration on that site. Little to no brush, as the presence of shrubs or severely impedes seedling establishment and growth. And so this is also important in the California context where there are these very large, what grow to be very large shrubs. Those shrubs will outcompete those small seedlings. And then of course, growing season moisture. And now that this current drought, this last drought is ended, we are seeing more winter precipitation and wetter spring conditions. And this is a good thing for regenerating or for planted pines. So the take-home messages, I guess, around sort of the ecology of bark beetle outbreaks and the ecology of forest succession and pine regeneration is that the modern over 100-year period without fires has created conditions that do not favor pine regeneration. And that's why we tend to see subcanopies, so these younger trees underneath our dominant pines that are this mixed conifer condition that are shade tolerant. Our white firs, incense cedar, higher elevations red fir. Now, the current mortality event has created overstory gaps and potentially, depending on the level of mortality, large openings that will be good for pine growth with planting assistance, because likely that seed bed isn't suitable for pines to regenerate on their own. Pine species have been on the landscape within California for a very long time, over 28,000 years, and are very well adapted to the environment. They're drought tolerant, they're fire tolerant. All trees have insects that kill them. And so trees that people possibly plant now are not going to be susceptible to bark beetle outbreaks for a very long time into the future because they need those larger trees. The insects need those larger trees. There are considerations, though, in terms of putting pine back on the landscape, and that's site suitability, the elevation and the different site prep. Those are two factors. Knowing that sugar pine is less drought tolerant than ponderosa pine, so don't be putting sugar pine on the worst, driest site. Tree density. You know, I think this outbreak has shown that very high tree densities and fairly homogeneous ponderosa pine forests at lower elevations have created a stress in those forests due to drought that made them very susceptible to bark beetle outbreak. So lower density planting and species mixes, right? Bark beetles are very specific. Western pine beetle will not attack a sugar pine. A mountain pine beetle will not attack a fir or an incense cedar. And so when you have mixed species, you minimize the damage that any one insect can do to that stand. Seed sources, and this is an interesting idea. We have a seed zone map in California, and so do we move between zones? And so right now I believe CAL FIRE is recommending anywhere seeds from 500 feet, where they currently are, you can move those up now. And this idea that they may be better adapted to the climate further up. And then a triage approach. And this is really important for landowners that have possibly lost a lot of trees and are feeling potentially overwhelmed by that, is prioritize restoration efforts. So if trees have died that have a lot of oak, maybe just let that site be oak. You know, let it be an oak woodland again. If pines have died in an area that's created really large openings, this could be a good site for pine planting with site prep and vegetation management as important parts of that. There might be areas on people's property that are still too dense, you know, where there's very dense incense cedar. And so some thinning might be required. And so breaking up landscapes and sort of looking at what seems to be the best strategy for any one piece of land and prioritizing these activities. So that's it for me. Any further questions people have, that's my email address. And if you are on Twitter, I often tweet about forest health and disturbance, and that's my handle. And that's it. Thanks.